He was just 27 when the original edition of The Wealthy Barber was first published back in 1989. It would go on to sell more than 2 million copies, making him a go-to expert on financial planning and eventually a panelist on TV's Dragon's Den. Now, more than 35 years later, he's back with a revised edition of his signature work for a new generation of investors. Here to talk about The Wealthy Barber, the fully updated all-time Canadian classic, is author David Chilton. Welcome, sir.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's great to be back. Every time I hear somebody talk about how long ago that was, I just shake my head. I've had a couple people, when the new book has come out, said, I'm kind of surprised you're still alive, because they thought I was in my 50s when I wrote the original. So, oh my gosh, it's all gone so quickly, but I'm thrilled to have the new book out.
Well, just to jump ahead, I was going to address that later on, but just to jump ahead, how did you acquire so much financial knowledge to actually sit down and write a book at age 27?
Well, it's interesting. First off, I was a true financial geek. To the nth degree. My grandmother got me hooked on it when I was about 16. I read hundreds of books, and there's no exaggeration there. In fact, what's crazy is when I took the Canadian Securities course all those years ago, over 30 years ago, I didn't even study. Not because I'm bright, but because I'd read so much information on investing in finance. I just drove down to Toronto and wrote the course. And, again, almost obsessed by it. But really, the interesting thing is the original book and the follow-up. There's not a lot of crazy new insights or newfangled techniques. It's the conventional wisdom, but repackaged in a way that makes it more accessible, more understandable, that pulls people in a more effective manner. And I think that's why the book has done so well over the years. The readers can relate to the narrator. They can relate to the other characters. They enjoy the read as opposed to being bored by it.
Now, here we are speaking in early 2026. A lot of time has passed since the original book. The world changing quite a bit since the early 90s. There was no Bitcoin. There was barely even an internet. So why come out with this now?
Well, you nailed it. There's been so many changes. Think about the new products, for example, TFSAs, a key part of most people's personal financial plans. We've got the FHSA, the First Home Savings Account. There's all kinds of new investment products. Many of them are very good for the consumer, very low cost, very efficient, therefore, like ETFs. All that had to be brought into play. And it's not as simple as just describing what they are, how they work, the pros and cons. How do they relate to each other? How do people prioritize? Very few people in these tough economic times can do it all. So how do you figure out which path to take first, which step to take first? On top of that, psychologically, it's more difficult now than it's ever been because of the darn internet, the algorithms. They know how to attack us, get at our weak spots, et cetera. And then probably the biggest reason, the cost of living has run so hot. We've seen it with real estate prices for quite an extended time, but in general, the cost of living is so much higher relative to incomes than it was. It is more difficult now. The boomers don't want to see it that way, but trust me, it is. When you do the simple arithmetic on it, especially for, I'd say, the lower 60% in income, making ends meet, getting through all of this is very difficult. Shelter costs are really tough on people.
Now, much of the core principles, as you mentioned, remain the same, including the fact that sound financial planning is best approached as a year-round activity. And given that 'tis the season for New Year's resolutions, what would be your best piece of advice for someone hoping to tune up their finances in January?
Well, it's funny because I was wrong in this particular subject matter, dead wrong. And it's the importance of doing a spending summary. It's something I paid no attention to on stage all those years and really gave it a very small mention in the original book. But over the years, I started seeing the impact that people were feeling by doing a spending summary, not a budget, very different. Budget is when you allocate your money theoretically, how am I going to spend it going forward? A spending summary, similar, but much more impactful. You chronicle all your spending on a 2 or 3 month period, categorize it, and learn from where the money's going. You'll quickly see where the leaks are, where you can save some money, but more importantly, you'll also see where you're spending inefficiently. And what I mean by that is you're spending money but not getting the appropriate joy units. Now, lots of our expenses are no discretion. Our shelter costs, obviously we have to pay for our house insurance, but there's a lot of money we get to choose where we spend it. The spending summary is very important. Everybody who does one of these things, and they are kind of boring to do, but everybody who does one reports big pluses from going through the exercise.
That seems like pretty sound advice for anyone, but especially younger Canadians for whom this book is dedicated. I think one of your characters mentions that in the book that financial literacy, until very recently, wasn't taught in schools. Do you think this generation is necessarily less well equipped to make financial decisions than its forebears?
You know, it's interesting. I think in general, we've taken some positive strides. Most provincial curriculums have made some changes, but the problem is now there's almost too much information. The kids spend so much time online. Heck, people like me spend so much time online that you're seeing all of these different pieces of advice and you're hearing all this yelling and screaming. There's a lot of noise. And so figuring out, okay, what can I truly trust and believe in, as opposed to what is somebody trying to sell me something or hype a product that they benefit from, that's very difficult for the average consumer. It really is. Plus, as I mentioned, there's more products, there's more accounts, it's more complex than it once was. So even though I think our knowledge level has gone up somewhat, the challenges of putting this together have also risen. The good news is it's still very doable. It really is. Most of this is not difficult to understand. In fact, the things that work are relatively straightforward to grasp. They're not that easy to do. It requires self-discipline, but relatively straightforward to grasp.
Now, much of the advice dispensed in the book comes from the wealthy barber in the title, through easily digestible stories and anecdotes. And I was wondering, why a barber? Is this based on someone from your real life?
No, it's not. You know, it's funny. The original idea was the wealthy bartender. And I actually got the idea, and people think I'm kidding, but I'm dead serious. I got the idea watching Cheers, the old television show. And I thought, you know what, I'll set it in the barber shop, or pardon me, in the bar, and I'll use the humor, I'll use the stories, I'll use conversation. And then, of course, alcohol got in the way of it being effective because I wanted to resonate as true. And therefore, I moved it over to the barber shop. And a funny story, I could still remember this vividly. It was a Thursday afternoon when I got the idea to shift locations. I drove to my parents' house, my father, a high school principal, just getting home. He is a very sharp guy, still alive to this day, extremely intelligent, but he has no business acumen whatsoever. He's never right. And I ran the whole wealthy barber idea by him, and he said, I think it's kind of stupid. And I knew then I had a winner. And then back to work we went and put it together. And as you know, as you may know, the book was constructed, and so was the most updated version, in a very unusual manner. I write it all by hand, and then it's all tested tremendous amounts of times with the target audience. So it's read to them, it's put out in different forms so that they can give us our feedback, and then we incorporate their suggestions, concerns, questions, comments, etc., right into the mouths of the character in the book. And I think that's why it ends up having such solid flow. It's not naturally gifted writing talents, unfortunately. It's that very unusual process.
I wanted to dig into some of the core steps in the book that have benefited me. The three most important words in personal finance: pay yourself first. How did you come up with this, what I would still call a revolutionary piece of advice?
You know, it's interesting. When I wrote The Wealthy Barber, when it first came out, I didn't know that that would become the item of the book that was so grabbed and would make such a difference. I knew it was the key because budgeting doesn't work. I got that idea from helping so many younger people to budget when I was an investment counselor and seeing that they couldn't stick to it and that the savings would never materialize. And I thought, we've got to start taking it off the top of the paycheck, directly out of the bank account, before we have an opportunity to blow it, before human nature gets involved. I didn't know it was going to go on to become what it did in terms of the way it was going to resonate and be grabbed a hold of by people. I would argue, by the way, 36 years later, after probably seeing more personal financial plans than anybody ever has, it's dramatic as that sounds, pay yourself first may be even more important than I said it was, because you clearly see the people who saved effectively, 90% of them have used that strategy. That's been the lead approach for the people who truly set aside the appropriate amount of money. So pay yourself first is absolutely imperative.
Another key piece of advice that I like: be an owner, not a loner, and own the thing that makes the thing. So not just saving, but investing.
Yeah, it's so key that we just don't leave our money, our long-term money. Certainly, if you're saving for a short-term goal, like you're buying a house in a year, you've got to stay conservative, you high-yield savings accounts, GICs, et cetera. But when you're setting aside money for 20, 30, and 40 years down the road, you've got to be willing to take on the volatility that unfortunately comes with being an equity investor, with owning common stocks, with owning pieces of businesses. You're going to have a lot of tough times, a lot of down days, a lot of down months. You'll even have prolonged periods of a year and two sometimes with very low to negative returns. It's frustrating. It's not easy to stay the course, but stay the course you must, because you're very well paid for that volatility. It's the price of admission over extended periods. And that's what matters here, 10, 20, and 30 years. That's where the best returns come. You're placing a bet on capitalism. You're placing a bet on human ingenuity and creativity. And that's a winning bet in the long term. So owning all of the ideas, the solutions, the innovations that companies are coming up with, owning a piece of that is the way to go. Lots of them don't work out. But the good news is so many work out spectacularly well that the total portfolio performance, the total market performance ends up being very good indeed.
Now, one of the ways that you help people hedge a bit is that you don't try to find the needle in the haystack. Instead, you own the haystack, which means following those index funds, those ETFs, those S&Ps, the TSX, following those index funds.
It really does. I mean, when you look at the track record of people trying to buy individual stocks or even professional fund managers trying to outperform the broad market averages, especially after fees, abysmal. I mean, you're talking fewer than 1 in 10. Some would argue fewer than 1 in 20 are able to do it. It's too big a risk for investors to take. Just own the haystack and invest in the broad market, invest in the capitalism we spoke of and the innovative ideas. You'll have some losers in that index fund, of course, but you're going to have enough winners that the broad returns, the big picture returns over extended time frames will be very, very good.
Now, we've covered some of the basics in the book, and as mentioned earlier, there are some topics that simply didn't exist in 1989. What do you think was the biggest change? Was it trading over the internet? Is it Bitcoin? What was the thing that you really wanted to tackle in this particular version of the book?
Well, I think unfortunately it's the negative of cost that I mentioned earlier. And so, yeah, there are definitely some new products. There are definitely some new accounts like the wonderful TFSA, FHSAs that have come out. But for the most part, a lot of the advice has stayed the same. How exactly you implement it, that's changed a little bit. But the broad picture thinking, big picture thinking is the same. What's more challenging now is the darn costs relative to incomes. So again, we talked about real estate. It's taking a your percentage of people's costs. And it's not just the mortgage costs, by the way. Look what's happening to property taxes in so many areas, home insurance, upkeep expenses. When you do a reno now, all of those costs in most areas in Canada have risen at a greater than inflation rate pace, greater than income level pace. And that means that there's less money to set aside for saving. And it's very tight. I mean, we talk in the book about choose your parents wisely. Unfortunately, has become an important commandment in Canada. It used to be said jokingly, but now, sadly, it is playing a very big role on who's able to get ahead and who's not. That is not a situation we want in the country.
Now, for many folks, and no pressure here, this may well be the first, perhaps only financial planning book they ever pick up. Certainly an awesome responsibility. What do you hope people get out of the book?
Well, I mean, again, one of the things I hope they get is some optimism to recognize that it is tougher now, but there's still lots of positive things you can do. I hope they come away going, wow, I'm surprised they understood all of that. It's not that tricky. There's not overwhelming math here. A lot of it's common sense. I really tried hard in the book to not only say, here's what you should do, but here's why you should do it. Because when people understand the whys behind the whats, they're much more likely to take that first step and much more likely to stick with the plan. And I find the feedback so far from people is, wow, I really enjoyed that. I've made a lot of notes. I understand that. I'm making this change. So, for example, the book talked about the importance of if you have a group RSP at work, and they're matching your contributions, for example, dollar for dollar, you're crazy not to be taking advantage of that. And I hit that theme hard twice and was very blunt, used humor, but was very blunt. Well, you cannot believe the number of young people who've already reached out and said, hey, I read the book and I've already gone down to payroll. I've spoken to the HR people and I'm finally involved in the plan. I had a 60-year-old interviewer. So one of the radio interviewers say, Dave, I hadn't done that. I'm embarrassed to admit it all these years. I reread the Wealthy Barber new version. I went down and took care of it. So there's lots of specific things, but I hope if nothing else, the book gets people thinking, realizing they can do this, that none of it's overwhelmingly complicated. It's relatively straightforward stuff. You have to understand some subtleties and some nuances, but I think the book presents them in a way that makes it more enjoyable.
The name of the book is The Wealthy Barber, the fully updated all-time Canadian classic. My thanks to author David Chilton.
Thank you for having me on.